The
Don't you
emergency
ever
room
question
at
me
Mercy
again.
General
Get
is a
out!
symphony of controlled chaos that never
You're
finds its
hurting me.
coda.
Let go.
But tonight, the air has thickened, pressurized by the arrival of a man in a tailored dark suit whose lethal calm suggests he isn't here for a cure. He's here for an audit. Before the storm breaks, there is Anetta Vance. She stands at the central station, her deep brown skin radiant even under the clinical glare of the overheads. She is the hospital's immovable grace, her natural hair pinned with a professional precision that barely contains the strength beneath. She is the silent anchor, the one who prevents the ER's constant status collapse through sheer, unthinked dedication. She is so focused on the charts that she doesn't feel the shift in the room's gravity. Dr. Gian Kuan Su, the chief surgeon and a self-anointed hospital legend, is striding across the linoleum. He is a man possessed by a god complex so vast he believes the laws of both nature and decency do not apply to him. No one interrupts his path. No one breathes. He stops dead behind Anetta. His expression isn't one of professional inquiry. It's a mask of unhinged authority, a snarl of icy malice that views her not as a colleague, but as a discarded variable. Then, he commits the unforgivable. His hand snaps out, fisting a brutal, entitled handful of her natural hair. He delivers a rhythmic, violent yank intended to shatter her dignity and force her gaze to his. The ER falls into a calculating quiet. Pens drop. Monitors scream into the void. Anetta doesn't flinch. She doesn't scream. She becomes a vulnerable giant, frozen, silent, and very, very still. He believes this is a display of absolute power. He doesn't realize that behind the thick glass of the trauma bay, Dante Kwon, the Iron Architect and the true owner of every brick in this building, is watching. The anatomy of a lie has just been exposed, and the reckoning has already begun. If you're ready to see Dr. Su's status collapse, hit that subscribe button and join our global family. Now, let's see what happens when the Iron Architect steps out from behind the glass. The silence in the ER wasn't the quiet of a room at rest. It was a calculating quiet, a sudden vacuum where the air felt sucked out of the lungs of every witness present. Dr. Gian Kuan Su stood there, his fingers still white-knuckled and fisted into Anetta's hair, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own unhinged authority. He looked down at her, waiting for the sob, the plea, the status collapse that usually followed his displays of dominance. But Anetta Vance remained a vulnerable giant, her spine a rod of iron, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance that he could not see. Then, the heavy glass door of the trauma bay slid open. It didn't bang against the frame. It moved with a precision that signaled the arrival of something inevitable. Dante Kwon stepped out from the shadows, his silhouette cutting through the harsh, clinical fluorescence like a surgical blade. He didn't rush. He moved with a lethal calm that seemed to pull the very gravity of the room toward his handmade Italian shoes. Every step was a deliberate audit of the floorboards, an announcement that the Iron Architect had arrived to inspect a failure in his own foundation. Dr. Su's head snapped toward the movement. His god complex flickered, momentarily blinded by the sheer, sovereign presence of the man in the dark suit. "This is a restricted area," Su barked, his voice a frantic vibration that lacked the weight of his usual command. "Who do you think you are? Get out before I have security throw you out." Dante didn't answer immediately. He stopped exactly 3 feet from the surgeon, his gaze shifting from Su's face to the hand still fisted in Anetta's natural hair. To Dante, that hand was a fatal detail, a breach of contract with humanity that required an absolute finality. "The hand," Dante said. The words were low, a vibration that carried the weight of a death warrant. It wasn't a request. It was a sovereign decree. Su laughed, a jagged, nervous sound. "I am the chief surgeon of this hospital. This nurse is under my jurisdiction. I'll do whatever is necessary to." Dante moved. It was a shadow's reflex, a blur of motion so fast the eye could barely register the shift in the air. Before Su could finish his sentence, Dante's hand, marked by the intricate scales of a dragon tattoo that seemed to breathe in the ER light, clamped around the surgeon's wrist. The pressure was clinical, a clinical sabotage of Su's own motor functions. "You are mistaken," Dante whispered, leaning in until his chilling pale gray eyes were inches from the doctor's. "You aren't the legend here. You are a variable I have just decided to delete." The doctor's grip on Anetta's hair finally snapped open as his fingers went numb from the pressure. Anetta didn't stumble. She took a single step back, her immovable grace intact, her hand going to her scalp not to rub the pain, but to smooth the sovereign dignity of her hair. She looked at Dante, and for a split second, a signal passed between them, a recognition that the hospital noose had just been cut. "Security," Su screamed, his face turning a mottled purple as he tried to pull his arm back. "Call the board. Call the owners." Dante let go of the wrist as if it were a piece of contaminated medical waste. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, obsidian-black card embossed with a gold crest. He didn't hand it to the doctor. He dropped it onto the nurse's station, where it landed with a soft, final thud. "I am the board," Dante stated, the words falling like iron shield plates into the silence. "And as of this moment, your Tuesday morning escape from accountability is over. Mercy General does not belong to your ego, Dr. Su. It belongs to me." The frantic rage in Su's eyes shifted instantly into a wide-eyed exhaustion. The realization hit him like a brake-line parachment. The man he had just assaulted his staff in front of wasn't a visitor. He was the Iron Architect. He was the owner. Dante turned his back on the doctor, dismissing him as a shattered icon, already destined for the grit and grease of the city's legal system. He looked at Anetta, his expression softening into an unburdened vigilance. "Nurse Vance," he said, his voice a precision instrument of respect. "The ER is no place for ghosts. Follow me. We have an audit to complete, and your physical ascent starts now." Anetta looked at the doctor, then at the man who had stepped out of the shadows to rewrite her fate. Without a word, she turned away from the nurse's station, leaving the grit and grease of Su's career behind her. As she walked beside Dante toward the exit, the calculating quiet of the hospital followed them, marking the beginning of a reckoning that Seoul would never forget. The transition from the frantic, sterile chaos of Mercy General to the calculating quiet of the Moon Estate was not a return to safety, but an immersion into a different kind of stillness. When Anetta Vance finally stepped out of the armored sedan, she wasn't met by the familiar, flickering neon of her neighborhood or the suffocating shadows of her past. Instead, she was greeted by a cathedral of icy malice, a sprawling residence of soaring glass and polished obsidian that felt as though it had been carved from the very heart of a mountain. The air here was pressurized and cool, carrying the faint, clinical scent of white lilies and expensive wood smoke. She stood in the grand foyer, her nurse's scrubs, once her armor in the ER, now feeling like a shattered icon of a discarded past. The floor beneath her feet was a chilling pale gray marble, reflecting her silhouette like a mirror. For a moment, the hospital noose of her memory tightened. She could still feel the phantom ghost of Dr. Su's fingers fisted in her hair, the grit and grease of his entitled rage. But as she looked up, she realized that the world she knew had been liquidated. Dante Kwon stood at the top of the obsidian staircase, his lethal calm, wrapping around the architecture like a sovereign seal. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled back to reveal the intricate dragon scales on his forearms, the signature of a man who moved the signals of the city with a single word. "You're trembling," Dante said. His voice wasn't a question, it was an audit of the situation. He descended the stairs with an immovable grace, his movements as precise as a surgical laser. I'm out of my element," Anetta whispered, her voice a deep, agonizing crack against the silence of the hall. "I'm just a nurse, Mr. Kwon. I don't belong in a place built on icy malice." Dante stopped on the final step, bringing him eye level with her. His chilling pale gray gaze locked onto hers, performing a silent audit of the heart. "You saved a man in an alleyway 3 months ago, Anetta. You didn't ask for his name or his status. You performed a precision instrument, of mercy on a stranger who was bleeding out in the grit and grease of the shadows. Anetta's breath hitched. The memory flickered. The rain. The shadow's reflex of a knife wound. The man she had stabilized using nothing but a belt and a prayer. She had never known his face, hidden as it was by the dark and the blood. That man was a variable the city tried to delete. Dante continued, his presence acting as an iron shield that seemed to push the walls of the room inward. You didn't just save a life. You saved the Iron Architect. And in this house, a legacy of debt is never ignored. A realization hit Anetta with the force of absolute finality. The man she had saved from the dark was the same man who had just dismantled a hospital legend with a single black card. She wasn't just a guest. She was a variable that had rewritten the equation of the city's most feared man. Before she could speak, Iris Kang appeared from the shades of gray, near the balcony, a figure of disciplined vigilance in a sharp, slate-colored uniform. She didn't offer the warmth of a colleague. She held the lethal calm of a sentinel. The guest suite is prepared, Iris said, her waitress's eye for detail noting the fatal detail of Anetta's exhausted posture. The architect does not leave his assets in a state of status collapse. Your Tuesday morning escape from that hospital was the end of your life as a ghost, Anetta. Here, you will learn the anatomy of power. Dante reached out, his hand hovering near Anetta's shoulder, not to touch, but to offer a sovereign protection. The hospital noose is cut. Tonight, you sleep in the cathedral. Tomorrow, we begin the clinical sabotage of every man who thought you were a shattered icon they could break. As Anetta followed Iris deeper into the obsidian heart of the estate, she looked back at Dante one last time. He stood in the chandeliered glow of the foyer, a possessive protector, watching over his masterpiece. The invisibility by design she had used to survive was fading, replaced by a slow-burn tension that felt like the beginning of a reckoning. She was no longer a nurse in the ER. She was in the sanctuary of the Iron Architect, and for the first time in years, her breathing was unburdened. The calculating quiet of the Moon estate deepened as the morning sun failed to penetrate the heavy obsidian curtains of the command hub. Anetta stood in the center of the room, feeling like a vulnerable giant, surrounded by glowing digital monoliths. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the rhythmic hum of cooling fans, the sound of a clinical sabotage in progress. At the center of this digital hive sat Iris Kang, the sentinel, her fingers dancing across a glass interface with a disciplined vigilance that made the very air feel sharper. Sit, Iris commanded, not looking up. It wasn't an invitation, it was a precision instrument of instruction. Anetta sat, her hands resting on the cool surface of a charcoal silk wrap Dante had provided. Across from her, a massive wall of liquid crystal displays flickered to life, bathing the room in a chilling pale gray light. Dante Kwon stood in the shadows behind Iris, his lethal calm, acting as an iron shield against the world outside. He was silent, a shadow behind the curtain, watching the anatomy of a lie prepare to unravel. Dr. Gian Kuan Su believes he is a hospital legend, Iris began, her voice a low vibration of absolute finality. He believes his status as chief surgeon makes him an immovable grace that the law cannot touch. But every legend has a grit and grease foundation. We have just completed the audit. With a sharp swipe of her hand, Iris sent a series of files cascading across the screen. They weren't just hospital records, they were the fatal details of a man's moral bankruptcy. Anetta leaned forward, her waitress's eye for details scanning the names and dates. Her heart performed a shadow's reflex against her ribs as she realized what she was seeing. These are scrubbed surgical logs, Anetta whispered, her voice a deep, agonizing crack in the silence. Patient 402. That was the spinal case from last spring. The official report said it was an unavoidable complication. The official report was a precision forgery, Iris countered, highlighting a specific string of code in red. Su performed that surgery while under the influence of a rhythmic tension brought on by a specialized sedative habit. He nicked the dural sac, panicked, and forced a junior resident to sign the falsified discharge papers. That junior resident was then liquidated from the hospital staff, his career a break-line perishment, to protect the legend. Anetta felt a slow-burn tension ignite in her blood. She remembered that resident, a young man of unburdened vigilance who had disappeared from the ER overnight, his reputation turned into a shattered icon. "There is more," Dante's voice rumbled from the dark, moving closer until he was a possessive protector standing just behind Anetta's chair. "An audit of the heart reveals that Su isn't just a malpractice risk. He is a paper gamble. He has been diverting hospital pharmaceutical supplies into the black market to fund a Tuesday morning escape plan. He knew the hospital noose was tightening, so he decided to squeeze you to feel powerful one last time." Iris tapped a final command, and a series of signals began to glow. Bank transaction logs, encrypted messages, and grainy CCTV stills of Su meeting with brokers in the grit and grease of Seoul's underbelly. The anatomy of power Su had built was revealed to be nothing more than a cathedral built on sand. "He thought no one was watching," Anetta said, her immovable grace solidifying into a cold, iron-forged resolve. "He thought I was just a ghost who wouldn't speak." "In this house, ghosts are given a voice," Dante said, his dragon-tattooed hand resting on the back of her chair, a sovereign seal of support. "Su believes he is performing a clinical sabotage of your life. He has already filed a report claiming you were the aggressor in the ER, seeking a status collapse of your nursing license." Anetta looked at the screen, at the fatal details of the man who had tried to break her. She realized that the hospital noose wasn't just a metaphor, it was a trap Su had been setting for years. But he had made one final, catastrophic mistake. He hadn't accounted for the Iron Architect. "What do we do with this?" Anetta asked, her gaze meeting Dante's chilling pale gray eyes. "We don't just reveal it," Dante replied, his lethal calm turning into a promise of absolute finality. "We use it to perform a clinical sabotage of his entire existence. We wait for his moment of highest pride, the gala, and then we trigger the reckoning. By the time the audit is over, Anetta, he won't just be fired. He will be a shattered icon that the world will trample." Anetta looked back at the screen, at the signals of her enemy's downfall. The invisibility by design she had worn for years was gone. She felt her physical ascent beginning in her soul. She was no longer a victim. She was the precision instrument of a sovereign justice. The calculating quiet of the room felt like a victory already won. The transition from a shattered icon to a woman of sovereign influence required more than just digital evidence. It required a physical manifestation of the power she had always carried within her. Anetta followed Iris Kang into the East Wing's primary dressing suite, a space of soaring mirrors and obsidian wardrobes that felt like a chandeliered altar, dedicated to the anatomy of power. The air was cool and still, a calculating quiet that seemed to wait for her transformation. In the center of the room, draped over a stand of polished steel, was the instrument of her physical ascent. It was a structured suit of deep navy silk, the sovereign color of the Kwon house. The fabric was heavy, woven with a density that suggested it was less of a garment and more of a legacy forged in iron. "The architect does not believe in disguises," Iris said, her lethal calm softened by a rare, disciplined vigilance as she moved toward the suit. "He believes in architecture. This is not meant to hide the nurse who survived the ER. It is meant to frame the woman who will dismantle the legend." Anetta looked at her old nursing scrubs, now a pile of grit and grease cotton on the floor. They were the uniform of her invisibility by design, the fabric that had allowed men like Dr. Su to treat her as a ghost. With a slow, unburdened breath, she stepped away from them. As Iris helped her into the navy silk, the material felt cooling and pressurized against her skin, an iron shield that settled over her shoulders with an absolute finality. The fit was a precision instrument of tailoring. The waist was nipped with a sharp, geometric edge, and the sleeves were long and structured, concealing the rhythmic tension that still lived in her wrists. When Anetta turned to face the floor-to-ceiling mirror, the shattered icon was gone. In her place stood a vulnerable giant who had finally found her height. Iris began to work on Anetta's hair, pulling it back from the anatomy of a lie that had been her scalp into a severe, elegant crown. She didn't use the pins of a nurse. She used precision clips of dark silver that caught the chilling pale gray light of the suit. The single tear of the highway was a distant memory, replaced by a lethal calm that mirrored Dante's own. A soft vibration at the door signaled a shift in the room's energy. Dante Kwon stepped into the threshold, his iron-forged silhouette framing the doorway. He didn't speak immediately. He performed a slow, deliberate audit of the situation, his gaze sweeping over Anetta with a possessive protector's pride. "The hospital Noose looks poorly on you, Anetta," Dante murmured, his voice a low vibration that felt like a sovereign command. "But this is a precision fit. You are no longer the ghost in the trauma bay. You are the Iron Architect's partner, the one who will oversee the clinical sabotage of every man who mistook your grace for weakness." Anetta met his gaze in the reflection. For the first time, she didn't look away to maintain the peace. Her immovable grace was now backed by the anatomy of power. She reached up, touching the lapel of the navy suit, feeling the iron-forged foundation of her new life. "Dr. Su thinks I'm hiding," Anetta said, her voice a precision instrument of calm. "He thinks I'm a variable he's already deleted from the equation. Let him believe in his Tuesday morning escape for a few hours longer," Dante replied, moving to stand behind her, his dragon-tattooed hand resting near her shoulder, an iron shield in human form. "By the time we reach the gala, your physical ascent will be his status collapse. Tonight, Anetta, the city will see you. And the legend of Dr. Gian Kuan Su will find its absolute finality." Anetta took a final look at herself. The vulnerable giant had reached the peak. As she walked beside Dante out of the cathedral of icy malice, the calculating quiet of the estate followed them like a sovereign escort. The anatomy of power had shifted, and the reckoning was no longer a promise. It was a blueprint already in motion. The calculating quiet of the Moon Estate had shifted from a sanctuary of transformation into a war room of digital, absolute finality. In the heart of the command hub, the Wolves, Dante's elite network of ghost shifters, began the clinical sabotage of Dr. Gian Kuan Su's reality. Anetta stood beside Dante, her navy silk suit casting a sovereign reflection against the wall of monitors as she watched the anatomy of a lie that was Su's life begin to hemorrhage. "The legend believes his foundation is made of iron," Dante murmured, his lethal calm acting as a pressurized weight in the room. "He doesn't realize he built his house on the grit and grease of other people's silence. Tonight, we will collect the debt." With a rhythmic nod from Dante, Iris Kang triggered the first sequence. Across the city, the signals of Su's influence began to flicker and die. It started with his iron-forged line of credit. At a luxury high-rise dealership where Su was currently finalizing the purchase of a limited-edition sports car, a Tuesday morning escape from the tension of the ER, the transaction didn't just fail, it vanished. The screen in the Moon Estate captured the fatal detail of Su's face through a hidden feed. His god complex flickered, his brow furrowed in a contorted snarl as the salesman politely withdrew the titanium card. Su's voice, though unheard, was visible in the frantic vibration of his jaw. He was shouting, asserting his status as a hospital legend, unaware that his status collapse was already being broadcasted to the only man who mattered. "He thinks it's a glitch," Iris noted, her disciplined vigilance never wavering from the scrolling code. "He hasn't noticed that his offshore accounts have been rerouted into a sovereign escrow. He is currently worth less than the scrubs he wore to assault you, Anetta." As the sun dipped below the Seoul skyline, the clinical sabotage moved into the professional sphere. Dante's Wolves initiated a shadows reflex within the hospital's internal server. Encrypted files, the fatal details of Su's malpractice and pharmaceutical diversions, were silently deposited into the inboxes of the medical board's ethics committee. Each file was a precision instrument designed to dismantle his legacy with absolute finality. Anetta watched as Su's private practice website went dark, replaced by a chilling pale gray screen. His professional signals were being liquidated one by one. By the time Su reached his penthouse, the hospital Noose had moved from his career to his home. The digital locks refused his biometric scan. His sovereign luxury was now a cathedral of icy malice that had locked him out. "He is looking for a door that no longer exists," Dante said, his dragon-tattooed hand resting near Anetta's, an iron shield of shared intent. "He treated you like a shattered icon he could break at will. Now, he is learning that without his title and his gold, he is nothing more than a break-line perishment in the history of this city." In the glowing light of the monitors, Su was seen standing in the hallway of his building, fumbling with a dead phone, his wide-eyed exhaustion, a mirror of the trauma he had inflicted on so many. The arrogance that had allowed him to fist Anetta's hair in the ER was gone, replaced by a primal desperation that clawed at his throat. He was no longer a god. He was a variable that had been deleted. Anetta felt a slow-burn tension settle into a cold, iron-forged peace. The invisibility by design she had used for years was fully dismantled. She wasn't just watching a villain fall, she was witnessing the anatomy of power being rewritten in her favor. "The audit is nearly complete," Dante whispered into the calculating quiet. "The gala is tomorrow. He will go there seeking a Tuesday morning escape, hoping to find an ally to save his sinking ship. But he will only find a reckoning, waiting in navy silk." Anetta met Dante's gaze, her immovable grace, now backed by the weight of the Iron Architect. The hospital Noose was gone, and as the digital wolves finalized the liquidation of Su's world, she realized that the physical ascent was only just beginning. The city was quiet, but beneath the surface, the Iron Architect and his partner were already drafting the blueprint for the final status collapse. The grit and grease of a crumbling reputation had left Dr. Gian Kuan Su in a state of frantic, uncoordinated motion. Within the sterile, pressurized walls of his private office at Mercy General, a space that now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a hospital Noose, the doctor paced with a rhythmic tension that bordered on the manic. His god complex was screaming, a deafening internal noise that refused to acknowledge the clinical sabotage already dismantling his world. He looked at his desk, where the signals of his ruin were piling up: a formal suspension notice, a frozen pension fund, and a series of absolute finality emails from the medical board. He didn't see the fatal detail of the small, obsidian-black sensor embedded in the smoke detector, nor did he realize that every sharp, desperate breath was being logged as an audit of the situation by Iris Kang. "It's her," Su hissed to the empty room, his voice a deep, agonizing crack in the silence. "The nurse. That shattered icon thinks she can rewrite the legend. She's the variable. If I delete her, the equation balances again." He sat at his terminal, his fingers trembling as he began to draft a precision instrument of character assassination. He wasn't just filing a report, he was constructing an anatomy of a lie so dense he believed it would act as an iron shield for his remaining influence. He typed with a lethal calm that was entirely manufactured, claiming that Anetta Vance had been diverted pharmaceutical supplies, that her invisibility by design was a cover for systemic theft, and that his physical restraint in the ER, the hair-pulling, had been a desperate move to prevent her from assaulting a patient. Miles away, in the calculating quiet of the Moon Estate, Iris Kang watched the words appear on her screen in real time. Her disciplined vigilance was absolute. She didn't flinch as the doctor's lies scrolled past, each one a signal of a man attempting a Tuesday morning escape from his own moral bankruptcy. Beside her, Dante Kwon stood with his arms crossed, his chilling pale gray eyes fixed on the digital feed. "He is digging his own cathedral of icy malice," Iris murmured, her voice a precision instrument of cold observation. "He believes that by destroying her sense of self, he can perform a status collapse on the investigation. He's already reached out to a contact in the police department to have her arrested for the very diversions he committed." Dante didn't move, but the air around him seemed to thicken with a sovereign authority. "He thinks he is playing a paper gamble with a ghost," Dante said, his voice a low vibration that carried the weight of a reckoning. He doesn't realize that Anetta is no longer a ghost. She is the Iron Architect's partner, and every lie he types is just another brick in the prison we are building for him. In his office, Su hit the send button with a flourish of god-complex arrogance, believing he had just initiated a clinical sabotage of Anetta's future. He leaned back, a shadow's reflex of a smile touching his lips. He thought he had successfully rerouted the signals of his ruin. He thought he was still the man who snatched people back from death, the legend whose gravity bent for no one. But the calculating quiet of the hospital was already shifting. Through the sentinel eyes of Iris Kang, every encrypted message Su sent to his corrupt contacts was being intercepted, logged, and prepared for the absolute finality of the gala. Su was unaware that he was no longer the hunter. He was a vulnerable giant caught in a web of his own grit and grease. "He's finished the draft," Iris reported, her fingers performing a final audit of the doctor's outgoing traffic. "He's heading to the gala tonight, believing his iron shield is restored. He's even brought the navy blue tie he wears for victories." Dante looked at the screen, then at the door where Anetta would soon appear in her sovereign silk. "Let him wear his tie," Dante said, his lethal calm turning into a promise of absolute finality. "He thinks tonight is his iron coronation. He has no idea it's actually his status collapse. The reckoning doesn't just watch, Iris. The reckoning waits for the perfect moment to strike." Outside, the city of Seoul glowed like a chandeliered altar, oblivious to the anatomy of power being rewritten. Dr. Gian Kuan Su stepped into his car, straightened his tie, and drove toward the Shilla Seoul, unaware that the hospital noose around his neck was already being tightened by the very woman he had tried to erase. The signals were red, the audit was closed, and the Iron Architect was ready to close the curtains on the legend. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Seoul was a chandeliered altar of crystalline light and filtered ambition, a sea of shades of gray, silk, and sparkling diamonds where the city's elite gathered to perform their nightly audit of social standing. For Dr. Gian Kuan Su, this gala was intended to be his iron coronation, the night he would use his manufactured anatomy of a lie to finalize the clinical sabotage of Anetta Vance's reputation. He moved through the crowd with a practiced lethal calm, adjusting his victory tie, unaware that the calculating quiet of the room was the pressurized silence before a reckoning. He stood at the center of a circle of high-profile investors and the hospital's board of directors, his god complex radiating an unearned warmth. He was in the middle of a precision performance, speaking of leadership and the restraint he had shown during a recent ER incident involving a troubled nurse. But as he reached the climax of his lie, the signals in the room shifted. The orchestral hum was cut short by a deep, agonizing crack of feedback from the ballroom's massive projection screens. One by one, the investors didn't smile. They retreated. Their gazes moved from Su's face to the screens behind him, where a fatal detail was being broadcasted to every soul in the building. It wasn't the keynote presentation. It was the audit of the situation, the scrubbed surgical logs, the black market pharmaceutical logs, and the high-definition footage of Su's hand fisting Anetta's hair in the ER. Su froze, his face a mask of wide-eyed exhaustion as he realized his Tuesday morning escape was becoming a public execution. The anatomy of power he had built on the silence of others was liquidating in real time. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and the calculating quiet reached a fever pitch. Anetta Vance stepped into the light, her physical ascent reaching its peak. She was draped in sovereign navy silk, her posture an immovable grace that made her unrecognizable to the man who had treated her like a shattered icon only 48 hours prior. She didn't walk like a victim. She moved with the lethal calm of a woman who held the audit of the city's future. Beside her, Dante Kwon moved like a shadow behind the curtain, stepped into the sun, his dragon-tattooed hand resting near hers, an iron shield of absolute authority. "The road is no place for a ghost, Dr. Su," Anetta said, her voice a precision instrument that carried across the silent ballroom. Su tried to speak, but his voice was a break-line parachment of stuttered excuses. He looked at the board members, seeking a paper gamble to save himself, but they turned their backs with an icy malice that was final. The chairman of the medical board stepped forward, his expression an absolute finality. "Dr. Su," the chairman stated, "the signals of your malpractice are undeniable. Effective immediately, your license is liquidated. You are no longer a hospital legend. You are a liability we are deleting from this institution." From the center of the floor, Su watched as Anetta approached. He looked small, a vulnerable giant whose hospital noose of lies had finally tightened around his own throat. The primal desperation on his face was a mirror of what he had inflicted on Anetta, but she felt no hollow grief. She stood before him, the chandeliered glow reflecting in her eyes, which were now forged and unbreakable. "You thought my invisibility by design meant I was nothing," Anetta murmured, her voice a low vibration of sovereign power. "You thought you could pull my hair and I would vanish into the shades of gray. But the Iron Architect was watching, and your status collapse is just the beginning." As Dante's security detail, men in bespoke black suits, moved in to escort a shouting, broken Su from the chandeliered altar, Anetta didn't watch him go. She turned toward the Iron Architect, her unburdened vigilance complete. The ghost at the gala was gone, and in her place was a woman who had finally dismantled the legend. The anatomy of power had shifted, and the reckoning was now a matter of record. The calculating quiet of the Shilla Soul Ballroom had transformed into a clinical, pressurized vacuum. In the wake of his status collapse, Dr. Gian Kuan Su had retreated from the chandeliered altar to the shadows of the service corridor, a break-line parishment in a designer suit. He was no longer the legend whose gravity bent the room. He was a shattered icon, stumbling through the grit and grease of his own fear. The heavy security doors at the end of the hall remained locked, an absolute finality, orchestrated by Dante's wolves. Su turned, his primal desperation flaring like a dying ember, only to find the Iron Architect and Anetta Vance waiting for him. They stood in the chilling pale gray light of the hallway, a sovereign duo that looked as if they had been carved from the mountain itself. Su fell to his knees, the anatomy of a lie finally stripped away to reveal the coward beneath the god complex. "Please," he gasped, his voice a deep, agonizing crack that echoed against the sterile walls. "Anetta, I was under pressure. The hospital, the legacy. I can fix this. I can make you a head nurse. I can give you the Tuesday morning escape you've always wanted. Just tell them the files are a mistake. Tell them the signals were crossed." Dante didn't move, his lethal calm, acting as a pressurized weight that seemed to crush the oxygen from the air. He reached into his inner pocket and withdrew a precision instrument, the obsidian black tablet that held the keys to Su's total liquidation. He held it out to Anetta, the dragon tattoo on his hand catching the dim light. "The audit is finished, Anetta," Dante murmured, his voice a low vibration of sovereign authority. "One touch, and the last of his signals are deleted. Not just his license, but his freedom. I can reroute the pharmaceutical logs to the High Prosecutor tonight. I can make his hospital noose a permanent reality. The choice of absolute finality is yours." Anetta looked down at the man who had fisted her hair in the ER, the man who had treated her like a shattered icon, to be leveled by his whim. Su looked up at her, his eyes filled with a wide-eyed exhaustion that pleaded for a mercy he had never shown. For a heartbeat, the shadow's reflex surged in her blood. She felt the ruthless urge to bridge the gap between them, to use this anatomy of power, to erase the memory of the grit and grease he had dragged her through. To destroy him would be a clinical sabotage of the ghost that had haunted her shifts for 3 years. But then, the immovable grace that had always been her anchor rose to the surface. She looked at her hands, hands that were no longer shaking, hands draped in sovereign navy silk. She realized that if she used Dante's power to ruin Su out of spite, she would be stepping back into the anatomy of a lie Su had created. She would be letting his icy malice define her physical ascent. "Mastery is not the ability to ruin another, Dr. Su," Anetta said, her voice a precision instrument of cold, iron-forged clarity. It is the strength to remain unburdened when the fire is at its hottest.
She didn't take the tablet.
Instead, she gently pushed Dante's hand away, her touch a signals check of her own newfound peace. I won't perform a clinical sabotage on my own soul to finish you, she continued, her lethal calm far more terrifying than any weapon. To kill your future with my own hand would be a status collapse of everything I've become.
You aren't worth the stain, John.
You are a fatal detail I am finally deleting from my story. She turned her gaze to Dante. The law has the signals they need. Let the audit proceed through the proper channels. I want him to live in the calculating quiet of a prison cell, knowing that the nurse he thought was nothing is the reason he is no longer something. Dante watched her, a slow, sovereign pride reflecting in his eyes. He signaled to Iris Kang, who appeared from the shades of gray, with a team of authorities. The audit is closed, Dante stated, his voice an absolute finality. As the police moved in to haul the broken, begging Dr. Su into the shades of gray of a waiting van, Anetta didn't watch. She turned her back on the grit and grease of his downfall, walking toward the exit with an immovable grace that felt like a physical ascent complete. The hospital noose hadn't just loosened, it had vanished. She had chosen restraint over ruin, and in doing so, she had performed the ultimate audit of her own strength. She was no longer a ghost. She was the Iron Architect's masterpiece, walking into a future where the calculating quiet was finally her own. The calculating quiet of the Moon Estate had transformed into a profound, resonant peace as the first chilling pale gray light of dawn began to bleed over the Seoul skyline. The night of the gala, with its status collapse and public reckoning, was now a memory being filed away into the audit of the past. Anetta Vance stood at the center of the grand terrace, her silhouette sharp and unbreakable against the rising sun. She was no longer dressed in the practical scrubs of a nurse or the borrowed robes of a victim. She wore her sovereign navy silk suit, the fabric catching the chandeliered glow of the morning light, a legacy forged in iron, draped over her shoulders. She looked down at her wrists, now bare and exposed to the cool morning air. The anatomy of a lie that had governed her life at Mercy General was gone. The scars from the years of invisibility by design remained, but they had lost their power to make her shrink. They were no longer fatal details of a victim's history. They were the iron-forged evidence of a survivor's physical ascent. For the first time since she had walked into that ER, her breathing was entirely, permanently unburdened. A soft, rhythmic footfall broke the silence, the lethal calm of someone who no longer needed to haunt the shades of gray. Dante Kwon stepped onto the terrace, his chilling pale gray eyes softening as they landed on her. He didn't approach as a master or a protector, but as a man who had finally found the missing variable in his own anatomy of power. He stood beside her, his presence an iron shield that she no longer needed for survival, but chose for companionship. The city is quiet today, Dante murmured, his voice a low vibration of absolute finality. The shadow behind the curtain has confirmed that the threat has been liquidated. Dr. Gian Kuan Su is now just a break-line parchment in the legal archives. There are no more ghosts, Anetta. Only the future we architect. Anetta turned to him, her wide-eyed exhaustion replaced by the immovable grace of a woman who had reclaimed her sense of self. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his coat, not in a lesson in obedience, but in a sovereign alliance. The status collapse of her old life had cleared the ground for this iron coronation, a reality where she was not a ghost, but a pillar. I spent years thinking solace was a place I had to find, she said, her voice steady and forged and unbreakable. I didn't realize it was a version of myself I had to become. Dr. Su didn't just pull my hair. He pulled me out of a life where I was drowning in the grit and grease of other people's expectations. He thought he was breaking me, but he only forced my physical ascent. Dante placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture of sovereign protection, that felt like a homecoming. They stood together, looking out over a city that was no longer a labyrinth of hospital nooses, but a canvas for their shared mastery of control. The anatomy of power had shifted irrevocably. Anetta Vance was not invisible. She was not hiding. She was the iron shield of the Kwon Empire, loved completely and respected fiercely. As the sun climbed higher, casting away the last shades of gray from the midnight highway of her memory, the Iron Architect and his partner descended from the terrace. Moving together, they stepped into a reckoning that promised only peace, leaving the wreckage of the past in the dust behind them. Anetta was no longer a stranger who didn't belong. She was the woman the city would come to admire, and as they walked toward the future, she never looked back, not even once. Stay blessed, like, and subscribe for the next twist.